Padres when he did this, that he believed Duke wasn't necessarily in favor of the war, but once we were in it, he wanted to win it. And we'd like to have your thoughts on his attitude about this.
Well, I think, a number of us had that same feeling. And I think that what Duke felt was what I felt at the time, and that is the great immorality of the Vietnam War was for our government to be asking young men to give up their lives in that war when the government had no intention of winning it, because they were afraid of what might follow that might be worse if we tried to win that particular war. And as I say, I think that was the great immorality. I think Duke felt the same. When he made the Green Berets, there was something more going on in Hollywood at that time than just whether people weren't in favor of the war. I remember that we'd call the theater, when the picture first opened, it opened to reserved seats, like a play would be. And Nancy and I couldn't get tickets to it. And we'd call the box office and say, has anyone turned in their tickets or anything that we could, and we couldn't. And finally, we called someone else that was supposed to be in charge of the tickets and found out that there were tickets for any night you wanted them. But you were being told at the box office that there weren't any tickets available. In other words, the people who were supposed to be promoting the attendance of that picture were literally keeping people away. And I called Duke and told him. And I think some John Wayne action took place rather quickly about that.
Was the opening successful? Because I haven't researched that yet. Do you recall?
I can't remember now what the outcome was or when. I think it did fine once that it was past that period and then available in theaters without reserved seats.
Both you and Duke wore the same POW bracelet, Steve Hanson's, for a long time, even on camera, I noticed. And apparently it had special meaning to him because Steve had sent his wife a picture in combat gear of the typical inscription, me as John Wayne, which has become an Americanism. Could you comment on that story and your feelings about Steve Hanson?
Well, just that I thought you might be asking about it. That's my Larry Stevens bracelet. But I have to say, I did wear more than this. I had several that I felt that I had to kind of change off on because there was another naval officer that was shot down that was, it was his widow. She didn't know he was shot down. She thought he was missing in action, not this one's wife. But this other one that back in the very beginning of the families coming together to form an organization about this, and this was Mrs. Hanson, and she came to, when I was governor, there was a meeting in the cabinet room there, and she was talking, and I'll remember that particular story for a long time because at midway in the meeting I felt something tugging at my pant leg, and I looked down. And it was a little 3-year-old boy who, when I looked down at him, said, "Will you bring my daddy home?" Well, then a naval officer returned who was able to tell her that he was not missing in action, he was dead, as was Larry Stevens. And they are now married. They subsequently married, this officer who came home. And Todd, the little 3-year-old boy, is now a naval officer himself. Went to Annapolis and all. But yes, Duke felt very strongly about things like that. And I didn't know as much as evidently he knew about the Larry Stevens case. But as I say, I had several of these from family members, and I used to try to get in some fair wearing of all of them.
It's we found some old news footage of Andy Devine introduced you at a political party that you and Duke both attended. And the footage doesn't begin at the right place. The only part we found, we don't really know what Devine said, but when it was your turn to speak, first thing you said, you stood up and said, "Well, I'd vote for Duke too." So Devine must have said something. I don't know if you recall that or not, but everybody laughed. They got a great laugh out of that.
I can't recall that, but it was true that, believe me, that Duke Wayne was very often at political gatherings and so forth, and most supportive of of me, and I was very grateful to him for it. And he was typical John Wayne when things happened, for or against. I remember, however, a meeting, and this was before politics for me, but back when I was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And this was at a time when there was a great communist infiltration of the motion picture industry. I don't think very many people are aware of this, that it really was, and it wasn't just something that a few of us dreamed up. The FBI was very much involved in it, and there was no question but that on orders from the Kremlin, it was to try and get control of the product of the motion picture industry, because at that time, Hollywood pictures took about 90% of the playing time of all the screens of the world. And Stalin had publicly stated this was the greatest medium for propaganda possible. And I remember one night at a Screen Actors Guild meeting, and I had been tipped off by the agency that how they operated to control meetings and to keep them going to the late hours until people would begin leaving, and then they knew their own count. And when they were then in the majority, if enough people left, then they would start passing the motions that they wanted. So I was made aware of that. And you know, you and I, if we were going to control a meeting, we'd go in a body and sit together. No, they scattered. So that every time the floor was released and I was chairing the meeting, their hands went up, all of them, so that no matter who you pointed to, you had a 90% chance of catching one of them. Well, being aware of this, and when it started, the thing about that, when the legitimate business was over, one of our people did what I had proposed doing, and that is made an motion for adjournment. And there was a second to the motion, and I called out in the audience, and I said a motion to adjourn is always acceptable. They started yelling, point of order, point of order. Well, their point of order was that the second was just an anonymous voice from out in the audience, and how could I claim that this had been moved and seconded and so forth? I hadn't. And I just looked out of the audience, and I saw Duke Wayne sitting out there. And I said, well, not at all anonymous. I said, Duke, that was you, wasn't it, that seconded the motion? And Duke says, of course it was me. You could count on him.
At a press conference after his death, you told the story about attending a gathering with Jimmy Stewart, who had just lost his stepson, I believe it was. And Duke saw to it that a war protester who was waving a Viet Cong flag was stopped. I mean, out of deference to Jimmy Stewart. Do you recall that? I mean, he was...
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what he did about it, whether he ousted the person. I would settle that that's probably what he did. But anyway, suddenly there was no longer any demonstration or interference with the meeting.
He had that power, didn't he? I mean, he made his presence felt.
Yes. He was a solid citizen.
Would you answer one last one, please, sir? And that is, he made an effective speech in '68 in the Republican convention, commenting on his hopes and dreams of his small daughter. And could you comment on your reaction to that, or the crowd's reaction, his dreams for this country? And his...
No, this one, I don't know whether I was not present at that particular session, because I wasn't at all of them, or not. But I was not present when he spoke, so I can't comment on that. I'm sorry to say, but.
Would you like to, may I ask your comments, any comments you'd like to give to close out? That we're doing this documentary, it is for public television, on John Wayne, called an American hero, I might add. So any last closing comments you'd like to make for us about the man?
Well, there's one thing that I think shows the character of that man as well as anything. There was a strike while I was president of the Screen Actors Guild. It was the first strike, the only strike the actors had ever taken. And I was getting quite a lot of abuse in the media and the press over this and so forth. And at that time, I was not well acquainted with John Wayne. You know, when you were at different studios, you knew about each other, but you didn't run into them as often as you might. And so I didn't know him well at all. And in the mornings for 7 months, I was out of that house to meetings that we were trying to get this thing settled and all. And Nancy'd be there with the morning papers, and sometimes they were worse than others. And I came home one day, and Nancy told me that she'd had a phone call that morning after I left, and it was John Wayne. And John also was reading the papers, and John, she'd never met him, and John said, I just thought you might want to hear a friendly voice about this time, and then told her how supportive he was and so forth of what I was doing. And he did that every morning when the press was hostile. She could count on a call from John Wayne just to cheer her up. And shortly after he had started that, another man who was a good friend of ours, Jimmy Cagney. So she had two boyfriends calling her every morning after I left. And it was typical of him. He was, and I remember in campaigning and so forth, and press questions directed to him and regarding the campaign, that he was as strong as anyone could be.
He really has come to epitomize that American hero in a right, true sense of that word, hero.
Yes, it was deservedly so.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.